When actually reading the tooltip for Tenacity, it sounds like it is exactly everything you could ever want as a tank. Increases damage done, healing done, and reduces damage taken. But the vast majority of guides will tell you that Tenacity is considered so bad that most tanks would rather have anything else but Tenacity. But why is that exactly? Well, it boils down to a few similar reasons, so let's talk about that. Tenacity increases the damage you do, the healing you do, and reduces the damage you receive by 0.1% for every 19 points of Tenacity you have. This of course means 1% for every 190 Tenacity. As the increase is linear, the more Tenacity you have, the more powerful the damage reduction will be, relatively speaking, which of course means that the more you have, the better this stat becomes, at the damage reduction portion at least. Now, in a vacuum, that sounds insanely overpowered, but there are a handful of reasons why it isn't. The first one is that because Tenacity scales somewhat slowly, all things considered, only giving 1% every 190 points, the upper limit of how powerful the stat can be is rather low. If you somehow found a full item level 660 gear set with a 665 weapon that all had full Tenacity on them, you would cap out at 2670 Tenacity, including the base 400 that doesn't do anything. This equates to 11.9% more damage done, more healing done, and less damage taken. This sounds pretty good, again, in a vacuum, as taking around 12% less damage just sounds good in general. The first major weakness of Tenacity, and the more common one pointed to when people think of what makes Tenacity bad, is the opportunity cost of choosing Tenacity over something else. The most comparable comparison can be drawn by saying, what if we had 2660 Determination instead of Tenacity? Well, Determination increases by 0.1% every 13.57 points, meaning 1% every 135 or 136 points. And while it loses the damage reduction component, those 2660 points of Determination amounts to 16.7% more damage and healing done, which is 40% more than what Tenacity could offer, relatively speaking of course. Now, sacrificing 12% damage reduction for an extra 4 or 5% more damage output and healing is a bit of a strange transaction, but we will get to why someone would do this a bit later. The second example is critical hit, or crit, because that is the stat you typically would favor over all others, rather than Tenacity. By default, a character has a 5% chance to do 40% more damage or healing with a crit. For every 9.5 points of crit, both of these values increase by 0.1%, meaning both the chance and the damage or healing boost. Unlike all other stats, this has the effect of making the value of crit as a whole increase the more you have of it. As a balancing measure, crit scaling is significantly worse than the other stats at first. Also, unlike the other stats, you have a base chance to crit, which means, in fairness, that the value of crit as a stat should not count this part. A 5% chance to do 40% more damage is equivalent to an average of 2% more damage output, in comparison to if you didn't have it. With 2670 crit, this changes to a 28.8% chance to do 63.8% more damage, which is equivalent to 18.37% more damage on average. Considering the base average of 2%, this is closer to 16.05% more damage. However, many jobs either have a way to increase their chance to deal crits, or flat out have attacks that guarantee them, which also come packaged with the ability to scale even better with the critical damage part of the stat. This means that having more crit both makes crit better to have more of, but unlike the other stats, again, having more crit makes buffs that boost it better too, since the stat also increases the damage of it. So for simplicity's sake, let's for now ignore many of the moving parts of what makes crit so incredibly good and just focus on the fact that crit and Determination both are at least around 40% better at improving your damage and healing than Tenacity is. Just for the record, Direct Hit is also around 40% better at improving your damage, but not healing, than Tenacity. Now, as I have brought attention to before, these stats don't live in a vacuum, and in fact, they can interact with each other. And what typically make them all better are the interactions between them. While a direct hit is bigger than a regular hit, and a crit is significantly bigger than that, a critical direct hit is way bigger than that. What makes crit the focal point just so happens to be that it becomes as good and also better than all the other stats, if you focus primarily on it, while the other stats mainly just benefit from scaling with each other. That is to say, since you are going to have points in at least one or two of the other stats aside from the one you are prioritizing, choosing to prioritize and focus on stats that scale best with each other is most effective at improving your overall performance. If there were multiple stats that had a positively reinforcing interaction with Tenacity's damage reduction, then there might be more reason to combine these stats in some way, but there is not. In fact, just like how stacking defensive cooldowns diminishes their total effectiveness due to stacking multiplicatively, Tenacity actually stacks in the same way with the defensive cooldowns themselves, essentially, quote-unquote, making your defensive cooldowns worse, relatively speaking, by simply having more Tenacity. Absurd, but not entirely false. Now, that is the stat-centric reason for why Tenacity is considered bad, but of course, Tenacity has a good property to it, which is known as the insurance policy. Let me explain. Let's say you have 5% Tenacity, reducing all damage you take by 5%. If you're hit by an attack, or even a combination of attacks that drop you below 5% HP in a very short time frame, then you having 5% Tenacity is what caused you to survive this. If you drop to 1 HP or close to, then it could even be argued that you would not have lived with even 4% Tenacity, and having those 5% Tenacity were ultimately crucial in your survival, retroactively making them the best stat investments in your entire gear set, at least for this one fight. This is similar to how Piety is considered worthless for healers, right up until the moment where your MP bar is actually empty, then you wish you had some Piety. With that said, there is another perspective to what makes Tenacity good, however, which requires looking a bit further than just the numbers alone. A common argument for choosing to have a lot of Tenacity is that having the damage reduction leads to healers having more breathing room to attack, meaning that you taking less damage with Tenacity is compensated for with a healer doing more damage. The second argument is that as tanks deal far less damage than a DPS, losing out on the potential damage you could have had by instead having more crit, for example, is next to nothing. And this is then used to support the argument that allowing the healer more attacking time is better. Let's start with the tank damage argument. Typically, in a Savage Raid context, a tank will be able to do somewhere in the ballpark of 2/3 of the damage of the average DPS job. A healer that isn't distracted by too much healing should typically be capable of delivering around half of the damage of the average DPS job. There are outliers here of course, with Astrologian doing particularly low personal damage, White Mage and Sage doing particularly high personal damage, and similarly with the DPS, the more supportive ranged jobs being on the lower end, and the more selfish jobs, and the melee jobs in general, being on the higher end. With that said, I will assume for this example that a tank can do 2/3 of the damage of a DPS, and a healer will do half of what a DPS will do. By this assumption, for every 1% damage output a tank sacrifices in the name of Tenacity, should by this argument result in a 1.33% damage output increase for the healer for it to end up being worth it. Now, some of you may already have thought ahead on this and realize where I'm going with this. In a dungeon context, assuming the tank knows what they're doing and the healer knows what they are doing, the healer will not need to stop attacking to heal the tank. At all. Saving the healer healing cooldowns will not increase their damage if the healer's damage was already fully maxed out to begin with. In fact, while incredibly slim, there is a better chance that the tank's temporary damage reducing cooldowns and the healer's limited healing cooldowns will run out if the fight drags on longer than it needs to, should the tank be doing less damage due to their stat priorities. The healer's likely to need to, or choose to, use the same amount of cooldowns regardless of whether the tank takes more or less damage due to memorized patterns. Similarly, there is a reason why Reprisal typically isn't considered strong enough on its own when doing big AoE pulls. And full Tenacity is approximately equivalent to having a permanent Reprisal. At the same time, more than a 30% or a 20% cooldown like Rampart tends to be unnecessary. Again, full Tenacity is like stacking Rampart and Reprisal together, while in comparison, choosing Crit instead is closer to having a permanent Summoner Searing Light buff. That is to say, while Tenacity is probably helpful when the tank itself isn't as confident in their defensive cooldown usage, or if the healer needs more practice, As the tank and healer gets gradually better, the value in having a lot of tenacity in a dungeon drops until it reaches 0. Now, in a raid context, tenacity is actually even worse, especially in a coordinated savage raid. Outside of boss-specific mechanics that may call for unusually enormous amounts of healing, healers will typically never need to cast healing spells directly on the tanks, and they will typically be able to coast by on whatever raid-wide healing the healers will provide anyway, combined with some of the single-target healing abilities the healers may choose to use, which they likely would need to use anyway, regardless of the amount of tenacity the tank may have. And while the insurance policy part of tenacity may be helpful in a tight spot, any mechanic that requires a tank to take it, that would possibly invoke the insurance policy itself, is likely to go beyond this point and flat out kill the tank anyway, forcing them to use an invulnerability cooldown, making tenacity unhelpful. This kind of "the healer would need to use their abilities just the same anyway" argument may sound vaguely familiar if you've ever heard why healers tend to melt direct hit for damage output reasons. Because of how direct hit has a positive relationship with crit and determination, having more of it increases your damage better than determination does for a healer or a tank, simply because they inherently have less of it since it is never on their gear naturally. However, as direct hit does not affect healing at all, it means that a healer choosing direct hit is choosing a stat that does not help their healing for a fraction more damage output instead. The reason being, the healer would need to use the same healing abilities just the same anyway. Having 5% more healing output from determination is not going to give you more opportunities to attack, or save you any MP, or lead you to needing one less healing cooldown at some point. However, having those same points invested in direct hit will make your attacks sometimes do far more damage, leading to enemies dying faster. Remember, the healer was around half of a DPS, so this matters too. So to summarize, the reason tenacity is considered such a bad stat is because it scales too poorly compared to the other stats, and while its defensive component is absolutely incredible, it exists in an environment where it is wholly and absolutely unappreciated because any situation that might call for tenacity can be done with alternative solutions. As long as vitality tinctures are not even considered in savage raids, the effective HP increase that tenacity offers can be viewed as irrelevant as well. And that is why one of my favorite stats, tenacity, turns out to be terrible. I hope you found this discussion interesting, but for now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, in Stormblood, tenacity replaced an attribute called parry, which increased your chance to parry. Back before Stormblood, parrying reduced damage by 20%, and this attribute was not exclusive to tanks, although probably only really considered helpful for tanks. Parry existed alongside a hit chance attribute, and piety not being exclusive to healers, and instead increasing the character's max MP. Nowadays, everyone has a 10% chance to parry, and it reduces damage by 15%, but only from physical attacks.